Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. There is lots to talk about. It's been a while since I put out a video. I wanted to talk about something that happened this week though. CNN has finally started to ask questions about the official OKC narrative, which I think is interesting. This happened just after my friend Jose went on Timcast, and he was wearing a shirt that said Terrance Yeakey didn't kill himself, you know, kind of like piggybacking off of the Epstein didn't kill himself shirts that everyone was wearing and the hashtag everyone was using. He decided to make a Terry Yeakey didn't kill himself shirt, and he wore it on Timcast, I think on February 8th of this year. So CNN published their article March 3rd. So it's just a couple weeks later, and it's actually a pretty decent article discussing the suspicious nature of Terrance Yeakey's death and the seemingly FBI cover-up of that death. And so I just thought it was interesting that CNN is bringing this up at all, right? OKC, and kind of asking in the article, they don't outright question the official narrative of OKC. They do about what happened to Terrance Yeakey and his death, but they kind of hint at it, right? They bring up John Doe number 2 and they say, well, there are some people that have been looking into this for many years that question the official narrative. And they bring up the Ryder truck and a couple other things. And I thought, ooh, this is interesting. For people who are unfamiliar with this story, just to give some background, Sergeant Terrance Yeakey was a military veteran. Right before his death, he was about to receive the police department's Medal of Valor for his heroic rescue efforts on April 19th, 1995 at the OKC event. Terry happened to be the first person to arrive on the scene that day, and he rescued many people. He saved many lives, pulling people from the rubble and debris that day. According to Dr. Wendy Painting, it is important to note how exactly they claim that Yeakey killed himself. So just to go back, he was one of the first police officers to respond to the scene on April 19th, 1995. He rescues people. They're going to give him the Medal of Valor, blah, blah, blah. But he sees things that day that make him very upset and concerned that what the official narrative is very different from what he saw. And obviously, there was pressure being put on him to kind of support the official narrative, which he didn't believe. So he started looking into this on his own, and then he ends up dead in what was reported to be a self-deleting situation. And so that's what the controversy is about this. And that's why, you know, CNN, their article was, you know, what happened to this cop, right? Okay, so Dr. Wendy Painting says it is important to note how exactly Yeakey is supposed to have self-deleted. He was said to have slit his own wrists and neck, causing him to nearly bleed to death in his car. And then somehow, as that's happening, he is able to like get out of the car, climb over barbed wire fencing, and then apparently walked over a mile in distance through a nearby field, and then eventually decided to shoot himself in the side of the head at a very unusual and weird angle. So it's just like an unbelievable story. And then interestingly, there's no weapon recovered at the scene of the body. And then there's no investigation conducted into this passing. There's no fingerprints taken. They don't interview family members or friends to determine why Yeakey would have been self-deleting, or if he in fact had been thinking about that at all. Instead, the conclusion that Yeakey's death was a self-deleting was just reached immediately without even conducting an autopsy. And that, I think, is why for even just people briefly doing the slightest bit of research into this, you would look at that story and say, okay, something isn't right there, except and unless you are a mainstream media journalist. So Yeakey had witnessed things during his response to the OKC event that did not comport to the official version of events touted by the national media and local, state, federal law enforcement at that time. He was in the process of collecting evidence that supported and documented the inconsistencies that he himself witnessed that morning at the scene itself. Far from being interested in self-deleting, though, Yeakey seemingly was in the process of maybe achieving, major life goals. He'd been just offered a job with the FBI in Dallas, and he was apparently planning on taking that job and moving there with his sister and brother-in-law. Now, he had previously served in Saudi Arabia, so he's, again, a military veteran. He was a 7-year veteran of the OKC Police Department. He'd just been promoted recently to sergeant, and just prior to his death, he'd been awarded the key to Oklahoma City for his heroism during the OKC event and him rescuing people. He additionally had recently reconcile with his ex-wife prior to his passing. So why would he be interested in self-deleting? It just doesn't add up. Despite all this, he was also living under constant scrutiny for his refusal to just go along with the officially sanctioned version of events. And because of his refusal to change his story about what he saw and heard that day, this caused him to suffer great persecution from other people in law enforcement who are supposed to be his colleagues. So while he was looking forward to starting his new job with the FBI, he is described by his family as having also been living in great fear. He was preoccupied with the nearly daily and constant harassment he was being subjected to. He showed up to his older sister's house one evening, and he just looked like physically ill. She wanted to take him to the hospital, and he said, no, they can find me there. And his sister's like, well, who is they? Who do you mean by they? And he didn't tell her because he was trying to protect her, apparently. But he left his sister's house that evening and was then found the next day in a remote field in Reno, Oklahoma. And immediately after his family was notified of his passing, they insisted that they did not believe that this was an event of self-deleting. Their conclusion was based on the manner of death, Terrance's personality, his recent statements about his hope for the future, and the lack of an investigation and an autopsy. At first, they tried to get answers like, hey, why isn't there a proper investigation? Where's the weapon he supposedly self-deleted with? Why wasn't an autopsy allowed? As they asked these questions, in the following days, they would sometimes be approached by others in the police department who basically told them in no uncertain terms, but off the record, that Yeakey had been murdered. As a result of their inquiries, they themselves were harassed and followed by OKC police and others, probably FBI, federal agents. Unmarked vehicles sat out front of their homes for hours, and that kind of stalking was actually caught on video by the family. Shortly after his death, Yeakey's ex-wife had her home broken into. There was a balloon left in her house that had black marker written saying, quote, "We know where you are," unquote, just written in black marker on the balloon. And that kind of harassment and surveillance had a chilling effect on the surviving members of Terry's family and on their inquiries into Terry's death, which were basically in effect shut down. And for many years, no one really cared about or looked into this issue. There were a couple folks in the independent alternative media who have kept the story alive. Richard Booth being one of them. There are many of them. I'm probably not going to be able to name all of them, and I apologize for that. I wish I could. I know Corbett Report had done many videos on OKC and on Terry Yeakey specifically. Dr. Wendy Painting has talked about this. The No Way Jose podcast has done shows on it. And so I just find it interesting, though, that CNN is finally now talking about this stuff. I kind of wonder what is the impetus of that. Is it really just someone going on Timcast, wearing the shirt and just kind of bringing it up again? Is that what forced this? Or is there more to the story? Is it that they're trying to get ahead of something else that might be coming out? Because typically that's what happens. But it could just be that the legacy media is no longer needed. I mean, let's face it, times have changed. There was a point back in the day when the legacy mainstream media was the place that everybody turned to get information and news about what was going on in the world and in their local area. If you wanted to know these things, you kind of had to rely on the legacy media. There was nobody else doing it. But now, in our modern internet and information age, you can just kind of Google anything you want to know and you can get that information. So far less people are watching the mainstream media or are reliant on them for information. And now there's tons of independent journalists, of alternative media that will talk about things and do deep dives on stuff like this that the national media used to laugh at and call crazy conspiracy theories, whatever. They now have to compete with people who will do these deep dives and will do real journalism still. And so I think it's interesting. I'd like to know what your guys' thoughts on this are. CNN published this March 3rd, so just 3 days ago. I find that I think it's a good thing. I believe ultimately it's a good thing, regardless of whether, I don't know if they actually care about getting to the truth of that, right? Although I'm sure there are some journalists, just a few like actual people trying to do actual journalism, like still in these legacy media outlets. But most of the people staffing these places now, they're not real journalists. They're political activists, and they see themselves as like defenders of sacred democracy, and they don't care if they have to lie to advance an agenda of social engineering. They kind of view themselves as part of the elite class, right, that has to tell you what to think. That's sort of what they've become. They've also had to deal with like clickbait stuff, right? And how they have to rely on that to get their funding nowadays. So they kind of have to appeal to things their audience wants to hear and say, the people that are basically paying to buy their crappy publication. So they've changed the way that they do things also. The legacy media used to do some journalism and they used to do some good jobs at it. But then after that, it just became all nonsense. So I think that I think this is a good sign. At least they're talking about it and we can bring this story into the public consciousness more, and maybe people will start asking questions about the entire story here, not just what happened to Terry Yeakey, but what he himself was looking into, which is, of course, the official version of what happened on OKC. And really, I think the fact that it was an inside job, that there was advanced knowledge, and that whole event served a purpose prior to 9/11. And we can get into that. That'll be a subject for another video. But anyways, I hope you all have a very good day.